condemned to make the same mistakes. I don't care what they say, I don't care about the names they rain on you. It's never too late to start again. It's never too late to have faith again. I know the places you've been, I know the shame that is suffocating you. It's never too late to start again. It's never too late if you're breathing.
Hello again. I am Dr. Parker. I am a licensed psychologist in Wichita, Kansas, and today I wanted to talk to you about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, what I hope to do in this video is first make a case for other psychologists that this diagnosis is actually underdiagnosed and missed quite often, which makes it very, very difficult on the patients and clients that you're serving, because now you are treating something incorrectly rather than treating what's actually causing all the problems. The second case I would like to make is to the viewer who's not a psychologist, that if you or someone you know has been suffering a great deal, especially for an extended period of time, and if the treatments they've been getting don't seem to be helping, then they may consider looking at this issue of post-traumatic stress disorder. Finally, what I want to do is explain how PTSD works and how to treat it. So to just kind of start this off and make the case for the underdiagnosing of post-traumatic stress disorder, consider the first criteria to diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder. And that is, the person must have suffered an injury or an actual threat to their lives or a threat to their physical integrity. And so oftentimes when we're talking about this, we're talking about auto accidents, combat experiences, rape, child abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse. But they also added a criteria a number of years ago that it's either they experienced it or they had prolonged exposure to someone who had experienced it. And that was because we noticed with, like after the 9/11, we sent a lot of volunteers in to help out with the first responders and the people who had been through the 9/11 experience. And yes, we expected the victims of 9/11 and the first responders who had to see all the carnage to probably have PTSD. But then we started seeing those symptoms arise, and the volunteers that went to help the first responders. And so we began to recognize that it's not just that you have to be the one experiencing it, but if you're exposed to repeated stories of it, if you're constantly being reminded of somebody else's suffering, this too can give rise to PTSD. So just stopping there for a minute, a traumatic experience. You know, the person, to be diagnosed with PTSD, the person must have had a traumatic experience or been exposed to somebody else who's had traumatic experiences. And so over the years, I've worked in hospitals, I've worked in prisons, I've worked in jails, I've worked in drug rehab centers. And I began to notice that a lot of people were suffering with various mental illnesses, symptoms, conditions. But a lot of these individuals had one thing in common, and that was in their background, in their childhood, they experienced some sort of abuse or witnessed the domestic violence going on in the home, or they themselves were, as an adult, the victim of domestic violence or some sort of traumatic experience. And there were quite large numbers that I was beginning to see, beginning to notice. You have to look in order to notice something. And so that kind of got me to thinking about, well, just, how much trauma is actually out there. And so I'm bringing you some statistics to think about, especially the psychologists out there, and we'll get to this. But from the National Sexual Violence Research Program, 43.6% of all women report experiencing some form of contact sexual violence. 43% of all women. And they break it down. 37% have experienced unwanted sexual contact, 22% have experienced a rape or an attempted rape, 16% have experienced sexual coercion, 14% reported being sexually abused as a child, 16% report being stalked, and 37% of all women have experienced a sexual or physical violence by an intimate partner, husband, boyfriend, or stalking. Well, what about men? And surprisingly, the numbers are rather alarming. 25% of all men have experienced some form of contact sexual violence. And then they break that down. 18% of men have reported unwanted sexual contact, 10% sexual coercion, 7% forced penetration, 3% have been raped, 10% report being sexually abused as a child, 2% report having been the victim of stalking, and 33% of all men report experiencing sexual, physical violence by an intimate partner or stalking. And then other polls, this one, 77% of all Americans report being in at least one traffic accident. 15% of all Americans report being personally the victim of a crime. 3% of all Americans report being personally the victim of a violent crime. And so what we see in the statistics is that there is an alarming number of men and women who have had an experience in their lifetime that would qualify in category 1A, that they have experienced some sort of traumatic experience, a threat to their physical integrity, their life, or a loss of control over their physical integrity. So right off the bat, practically 43% of all women already meet the first criteria, and 33% of all men meet the first criteria. So if we start there and then think about, as psychologists, how often are we really asking about traumatic experiences in a person's past? We speak to them about how they're doing now, and they report being depressed or anxious or trouble sleeping or irritability, or they're in arguments with their wife, or they're getting in trouble at work, or they're drinking too much. And then we focus in on those things they report to us and begin trying to treat those specific things. But if we are not actually addressing what generated these symptoms, then we're really not going to be of a lot of assistance to this person, because that traumatic experience lives on inside their brain. And so for psychologists, I encourage you strongly to rethink your intake and to rethink your diagnostic interview, and to pay a little more attention into the person's past and recent experiences, and see if there are any experiences they've had that may qualify as some sort of trauma. Then, for the individual who's not a psychologist, who's watching this video, think about your own life. Were you abused as a child? Were you in a domestic violence situation in your marriage? Did you go through a serious auto accident? Were you in combat? Or were you exposed to these things? Did you witness your parents in the middle of domestic violence and the yelling and the screaming while you were at a young age? Did you see somebody else get coerced into something? Or did you have to spend time with a person who had been, say, for example, raped, but you had no power to take away their pain and suffering other than to comfort them, and you're listening to this story over and over again, trying to help them out? These are really important things to think about and then to talk to a psychologist about, because your anxiety, your panic attacks, your trouble in relationships, your anger issues, your substance abuse issues may be rooted in this trauma. And when I get through how PTSD works, you'll see how that makes sense. To understand how PTSD works, I think it's easier if we first understand how the brain works. So, your brain processes data. And so with everything that occurs in life, your brain has to do 4 things with it. First, you must acknowledge what occurred. Secondly, you have to decide what that all meant. Third, you have to decide, what does it mean about me now? And then fourthly, you have to decide, how am I going to live my life now based on these experiences that I've had and who I've become? Now, this sounds really complicated, but the truth is you do it every second of every day. If you walk out a Quick Trip and some cute person smiles at you, you get in your car, you start to drive away, but you think, hey, they smiled at me. Why would they do that? Maybe they thought I was cute. You know what? I still got it. And then you turn up the music and you sing a little bit and you smile, and later in the day, people look at you as you walk a little taller and smile a little more, and they say, hey, why are you in such a good mood today? And you say, I don't know, it's just kind of been a good day. In the blink of an eye, you did those 4 things. You acknowledged what occurred. They smiled at me. They must think I'm cute. You decided what it all meant. Then you decided, what does it mean about you now? Well, I am. And then you own that meaning, and you walk a little taller, and you smile a little more, and other people see the change you have made in your life based on this experience. Now, when it comes to ugly stuff, we don't like to do that. When it comes to ugly stuff, we don't want to think about it. So here's what happens with ugly stuff. Let's say this is the bad thing. So the bad event happens, and as it's occurring in real time, I feel horrified. Now the bad thing is over, so it moves into the past. In the present, when I think about what occurred in the past, I feel horrified. So I'm not dumb. I don't like feeling horrified, so I don't want to think about it. So I do this. Now notice what I just did. I took in a deep breath. I tensed my body. I pushed this aside, put it behind me. What am I doing? I'm mustering up stress. Think about it. Post-traumatic stress disorder, big fancy term. What does it mean? Post, after, so in the past, traumatic, bad thing. So after the bad thing, I am stressed out. And so this is what's happening. When the bad thing occurs, it causes me horror. Now the bad thing is done, it's in the past, but when I think about this bad thing in the past, in the present, I experience the horror. So in the present, I protect myself by mustering up stress to guard against this memory. And so I physically tense and psychologically shove this aside. So I do this. And some people actually do this live and in person. You know, they'll be talking about something bad, and you will see them go, you know what, we just got to put that behind us and go on. And they will get up and walk away from you. They will get out of the chair and they'll start walking around. They're intentionally mustering up the stress to protect themselves from the bad memory. Now that this is shoved away nice and neatly in the closet, this cannot be the answer to the question that I'm about to ask. So here we go. I have the bad thing happen. It's in the past. I don't want to think about it. I put it behind me. Now, I'm left with the stress. So my heart's racing, my muscles are tense, I feel a little edgy, irritable, maybe I'm sweating a little bit. I feel like there's something going wrong out there somewhere. doom and gloom. I feel like people are watching me, and I ask, why do I feel this way? Why do I feel depressed? Why do I feel anxious? Why do I feel angry? And because my radar is up, I am looking for the bad thing. This ain't it, because I've shoved it away. So now I'm going to find it out there. Thus, the post-traumatic stress that we're talking about, that we're treating, is actually our own self-defense mechanism coming up, protecting us from this memory. The problem is those 4 steps. Our brain has to do those 4 steps. Acknowledge what occurred, decide what it all meant, decide what it means about me now, and then incorporate that into my sense of self and live my life based on this experience. But because the memory is so horrifying, I interrupt that process and shove it behind me. So now I'm kind of trapped. I've got the stress mustered up to protect me from the memory. If I relax, the memory could come back. So I have to keep the stress up. So I walk around all day kind of hypervigilant, on guard, antsy, bouncing off the walls. It's hard to concentrate in class. It's hard to pay attention to what somebody is saying. And if something happens that reminds me of this, it's like an arrow shooting back there, and it hits, and all of this stuff comes rushing back up. And so now I find myself avoiding things that might remind me of this. And so I muster up more stress to block things out, to keep me from remembering this so that I don't feel the horror that this brings. Are you following me? So what I am left with is what we see in the later criteria of PTSD. Trouble concentrating, paying attention, doing cognitive kind of processes. And then I have trouble sleeping. I'm on guard all the time. I'm irritable. I have anger outbursts. Well, since I've locked this away, this can't be the answer to why this is happening. And so I feel so uncomfortable all the time. A lot of people then turn to alcohol or marijuana or other substances to try to make this stress feeling feel better. But it's temporary at best, because this is constantly here. It's not going anywhere. The best visual I can think of for understanding how trauma works, I had a neighbor who had a golden lab, and bless his heart, he didn't know a lot about dogs. And so one day I was out back drinking some coffee, and I was watching, and he walked out to his garden to tend to his flowers, and the dog came along and was getting in his way. And so, being the smart guy that he is, he puts the dog on the leash and walks over to the blue BFI trash can and ties the leash to the trash can. And then he walks back to the garden. Well, the dog follows his master. And as he walks behind his master, he pulls the trash can over. Now, this next part, you've got to see from the dog's perspective. The dog's walking along doing nothing, and then suddenly, boom, this big blue monster attacks him. So the dog takes off running around the yard. Well, he's tied to the trash can, so he's dragging the trash can. But in the dog's mind, the monster attacked him, and now when he looks back, the monster is chasing him. So he takes off running even harder around the yard, and the harder he runs from the big blue monster, the harder the big blue monster chases him. And my neighbor had to run over and tackle his dog, hold him still, unleash him from the trash can, and then show him, you can be here and the trash can can be there. And you can walk around over here, the trash can's not going to bother you. You okay now? And the dog's okay. And as I was watching this unfold, I thought that's exactly how trauma memories work. We lock them out, but they're pushing because they know we have to do those 4 steps, and they're telling us, think about me, think about me, think about me. Well, I don't want to think about them, so I start running from them. Well, the harder I run, where does the memory live? In my brain. So the harder I run away from the memory, it feels like the memory begins chasing me. And so the harder I run, the harder the memory chases. And so there I am running around the society. I'm running around the neighborhood. I can't sit still. I'm busy. I'm hot. I'm cold. I enjoy things immensely. I get angry very easily. I'm just a live wire. And if we start adding in alcohol and other things, and it becomes a very, very confusing, complicating thing. And it just makes matters so much worse when you reach out for help and the psychologist doesn't recognize the power of this trauma memory that you're running from. And so you're telling the doctor you feel anxious all the time, and maybe the medical doctor gives you some pills to help you feel more comfortable, but this isn't going anywhere. So as soon as the pills wear off, it's back in there again, and you're off and running again. So now you need more medicine. You're working so hard at keeping this out of your mind, you may not even think to tell the doctor about it. Like, how are you doing? I'm good, I'm just anxious all the time. Well, any reason why you're anxious? Nope. Maybe it's embarrassing. Maybe you're ashamed of it. Your medical doctor and your psychologist, two people that you should never be ashamed to tell everything to, because without the information, they can't help you. And hopefully, the psychologist or the medical doctor recognizes the power of what's happening here. Because think about this, post-traumatic stress. After the bad thing, stress. So implied is before the bad thing, there was no issue. So what we have is really not a mental illness. What we have is what we might call a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. The very name of the diagnosis infers that if it weren't for that event, you would be fine. So the fact that you're having a reaction to a rape, the fact that you're having a reaction to an auto accident, the fact that you're having a reaction to having been abused as a child is normal. And if a situation, post-traumatic stress, if a traumatic situation can bring about this condition, then another situation should be able to help you deal with and eliminate the stress. See, if a situation can bring the stress on, it stands to reason that a situation can take the stress away. What situations might help take the stress away that was brought on by the traumatic experience? And this is where therapists have so much skill and power and ability, and they're throwing it out the window if they don't recognize that they actually have the power to help somebody feel so much better and get so much more control over their lives, so much more control over their anger, their substance abuse, so much more control over how their relationship is going and how they're parenting, if they will bring this traumatic issue to the psychologist, and the psychologist will help them deal with that traumatic issue. Now, how do you deal with such a traumatic issue? And there's many different schools of thought, many different approaches to these things. I try to keep things rather simple. And so if our brain naturally has to do 4 things with everything that occurs: acknowledge what occurred, decide what it all meant, decide what it means about me now, incorporate that meaning into my sense of self, well, that sounds like a pretty good treatment. And so as a psychologist, if somebody comes to me with a traumatic event in their past, step 1 is to help them acknowledge what occurred. Now, imagine this. Imagine I had a deck of cards, and I spread the deck of cards out on the table face up, shuffled them all up, and spread them all out. They're all mixed up. And I asked you, put these cards in order. Well, simple. You'd look and you maybe decide, hearts, clubs, diamonds, and you start organizing. Like, wait a minute. Before we do that, let me blindfold you. So now you can't see the cards. Now, put them in order. So too many times therapy, too many times people on their own try to make sense of what occurred in the past, but they're not actually able to look at it. They're not actually able to see it. So the memory comes rushing in, they have a breakdown, they wake up crying, and now they think about all this horrible stuff that happened, and in the midst of this tremendous feeling of horror and shame and guilt and regret, they try to make sense of something that they normally can't even think about. And so it's akin to trying to put these cards in order without actually being able to look at the cards. So what I ascribe to is that 4-step process, but one step at a time. So step 1, acknowledge what occurred. Don't even try step 2, 3, and 4 until you can do step 1. And there's no time frame. There's no time limit. But what needs to happen is your brain needs to begin to trust you, that you are actually doing this and you're actually working on things. So imagine this. Imagine you have a friend, and we all have a friend like this, but this is somebody you cannot believe a word that comes out of his mouth. If he's moving his lips, he's lying. And so your friend says to you, hey, I'll come by tomorrow at 6 o'clock. No, they're not. You don't, whatever. You don't think about it. You don't plan on it. You don't bank on it. You go on with the rest of your day. But then he shows up. Like, what are you doing here? Well, I told you I'd be by at 6 o'clock, right? Well, yeah, but I didn't think you meant that. Well, I said I would, so I am. And you all talk a little bit, and he leaves and say, I'm going to stop by again tomorrow about 6. Not twice, no. He's up to something. I don't know what's going on. And the next day he's there at 6. You're like, what's going on with Steve here? I don't understand this. And then he says, I'll be back tomorrow at 6. And the next day he's there at 6. And the next day, and the next day. And after a little bit, you begin to think, you know, maybe Steve's trustworthy. Maybe I can rely on him. And he says he's going to be here at 6. And so now you kind of start planning around that. You know, he says, I'll stop by tomorrow at 6 and say hi. Okay. So when somebody else calls and asks me to dinner, I'm like, no, Steve's going to stop by. Let me call you after I'm done with him. And he shows up. And at some point in this, Steve says, I'll see you tomorrow at 6. And you're like, okay. And then it's just a natural acceptance that tomorrow you'll see Steve at 6. No doubt, no question. Well, this is what happens with our trauma memories. Most people who've been through some sort of trauma like that will periodically pull it out, and they'll look at it, and they'll cry about it, and they'll have this big cathartic moment, and then they pack it back in the closet. And they think they've done something, but they really haven't. And so the memory is trying to push in for you to think about it, for you to decide what it all meant, for you to decide who you are because of this, for you to incorporate it into your purpose in life. But the memory can't trust you, so it pushes all the time, even after you have thought about it one time. And I get this a lot from a lot of people. I'm going through the intake, talking about their history, and they'll say, yeah, this happened to me. So, okay, well, have you ever worked on that, processed it, talked about it? Like, yeah, me and my last therapist 5 years ago, we talked about it. You talked about it? Yeah, I told him all about it. And did you do any work in therapy on it? No, but I told him about it, though. So we don't need to deal with it. One time, probably not enough. So I have a suggestion for how people can begin the process of acknowledging this memory. I recognize that, this is something that they've kept hidden, protected away for a very good reason. And that things that remind them of this, those things start to become painful to them as well. So they begin to avoid those things. So for example, if I was traumatized, say, in a blue pickup, Now when I get around blue pickups, I may start to feel anxious. If I was in a fiery truck accident, now when I get around a truck, I may start to feel anxious. So I begin to avoid trucks. And I don't want to get in a truck. I don't want to ride in a truck. I see one drive by on the street. I have a panic attack. And so I begin to avoid the street. So this dynamic is in play, and it interferes with treatment a lot because therapists don't recognize that by bringing the person in each week and saying, all right, let's talk about the trauma, therapy becomes a place that reminds them of their trauma. And so now when they start thinking about going to therapy, they start to feel anxious and they don't want to come to therapy, and they find reasons to reschedule or cancel or just no-show out altogether or stop coming in because the therapy is becoming uncomfortable because it's triggering these memories and the emotions that come along with those memories. And so they naturally begin to avoid the things that remind them of the trauma. That's one of the criteria. So for a person to avoid things that remind them of the trauma is expected. It's not that they're a bad person or that they're not treatment compliant or that they're not serious about treatment. It's one of the dang criteria to diagnose the PTSD in the first place. So what I will do is I will turn control over to the client. And I'll tell them, when you come in, we will talk about whatever you want. Certainly this is an issue that the more we address it, the better you will feel in time. But that's up to you. Now, in the meantime, if you want to work on it without me there, get a notebook, get a timer, set a time every day, and every day at that exact same time, 6 o'clock, the alarm goes off, you get out the notebook, and you set a timer for 15 minutes. Once you get the timer set for 15 minutes, notebook's open, you open the memories. And you allow yourself to think about the traumatic memories. And it doesn't matter at this moment exactly what you're doing. You open the notebook, you open the memory, and you think about the memory. You write stuff that you remember, you write the story of what occurred, you read what you wrote the day before, you stab the notebook, whatever. But when the alarm goes off after 15 minutes, you close the notebook and you close the memory and you put it aside. Now the other 23 hours and 45 minutes of the day is where the real work starts to come in. Because just thinking about it for 15 minutes is not going to stop the memory from trying to get in. It doesn't trust you. You've said before, I'll deal with it. You've said before, so the memory is still going to push. Think about me, think about me. No, I don't want to think about you. And you do this work that I suggest, and you're like, why am I still bugged by this? Well, it's the process. That's the post-traumatic stress. So you choose to spend 15 minutes with it, and then the other 23 hours and 45 minutes, you choose what else to do. Instead of saying, I'm not going to think about it now, you tell yourself, I have thought about it, now I'm going to go to work. Now I'm going to spend time with my family. And when the memory does come up, and it will, you look at the memory. And if you have to do this out loud and just look psychotic to your friends, you do it. But you look at the memory and you say to it, listen, you are important, and I know you're important, and I am beginning to work on you, and I'm giving you 15 minutes every single day at 6 o'clock. Now, I am trying to focus on my job, so I will see you tomorrow at 6 o'clock. And then you turn your attention to what you're doing in the moment. Now, this isn't going to work magic the first time. It may not work magic the first 20 times, but this is how you approach that memory popping up, popping up, popping up. Is you look at it and say, you are important, I will deal with you at 6 o'clock tomorrow. Right now, I'm trying to eat my dinner. Now, just like with your friend Steve, the memory doesn't believe you, so it's going to keep pushing. But tomorrow, When you sit down at 6 o'clock and open the notebook and bring the memory back out, the memory says, hey, he's thinking about me. It's twice. That's, you know. But the third day and the fourth day and the fifth day and the sixth day, the memory starts to trust you that you are acknowledging it is important. You are acknowledging it needs to be thought about. You are taking the steps to begin the process of dealing with this traumatic memory. And so the first thing that begins to happen is the memory stops pushing. So you no longer need to push back. You don't have to shove the memory in the closet anymore and keep it locked in there because you're no longer running from it. You're scheduling it. Once you get to the point of doing this simple exercise every day, there will come a time when you can open that notebook, remember what occurred, write the story, look at the other things. Now, you may be sad and you may cry and you may be mad, but you won't be freaking out. You won't be having panic attacks. When you can do that, then you're ready for step 2. Now you can look at the playing cards and see them. Now you can begin to make sense of the memories. And then you can move to step 2 and step 3 and step 4. But if you can't do step 1, all of that cool therapy kind of work stuff is going to be useless and maybe even harmful. So, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, after the bad thing occurs, I am stressed out. The symptoms of that stress, irritability, anger outbursts, anxiety, trouble sleeping, trouble thinking, depression, drinking a lot, smoking a lot of dope, doing things that are, snapping at other people, getting in arguments with your wife, having trouble in relationships, reacting to things that other people tell you shouldn't be overreacting to. These may be anxiety, they may be panic attacks, but if you have a traumatic event in your past, there's a stronger likelihood that all this drama, all this suffering that we've got going on in our lives is rooted in this traumatic event. And so it makes sense as the psychologist to really put a lot of energy and effort into getting a good history with this person so you can see if these things are back there and see if these things could be generating what's happening in the present. And it makes perfect sense for the patient to go into their doctor and be honest about those things so that they, along with you, can help you process these things and work them out so that they become a part of your life and so that you are now living your life because this occurred. And as I showed you with the statistics, a large majority of Americans have experienced something that very easily could qualify as a traumatic memory now. So in just many different ways, it makes perfect sense to stop and rethink everything that's been going on in your treatment, everything that's been going on in your life, and consider the possibility that it's really all rooted in this traumatic memory and my efforts to avoid it. I'm Dr. Parker. I hope you have found this helpful. And even if you're not a person who struggles with something like this, you probably know somebody who does. So I would encourage you to forward this video to them. Maybe you can help them out. Think about it. Change how you think.
Condemned to make